Hey, I am Kalia, and I am 32 years old. My husband, Torin, always told me his mother was just fiercely protective, but I should have recognized the malice masking itself as maternal love. Vespera never liked me. I was a self-made architect from a working-class neighborhood, and she was a high society matron who believed bloodlines dictated worth. When Torin and I got married, she wore black to the ceremony. She claimed it was a modern fashion choice. I knew she was mourning the loss of her control over him. We bought a beautiful mid-century house in the hills. I paid for most of the down payment. Torin was struggling with his tech startup, burning through cash while I spent late nights drafting blueprints to keep us afloat. I thought I was building a solid foundation for our future. Vespera would visit unannounced, running her manicured fingers over my dusty drafting tables, leaving trails of condescending remarks. She often brought up how Torin needed a woman who could focus entirely on his needs, not someone distracted by career ambitions. Torin rarely defended me. He would just squeeze my shoulder and whisper that she meant well. I swallowed the disrespect because I loved him. I wanted peace. I ignored the odd late-night phone calls he received and his sudden weekend business trips. I was too busy holding our financial lives together to notice the foundation of my own marriage rotting from the inside out. The cracks shattered completely on a damp Tuesday morning. I was standing in the kitchen pouring coffee when my phone buzzed with an international number. It was the hospital in London. My mother had suffered a severe stroke. The doctor on the other end of the line used words like critical and prepare yourself. The ground vanished beneath my feet. I dropped the mug, letting hot coffee pool around my bare feet. Torin rushed in, his face tight with feigned concern. When I choked out the news, he immediately booked me the next flight out. He packed my suitcase while I sat on the edge of the bed, paralyzed by panic. I asked him if he was coming with me. He gave me a sad, practiced smile and kissed my forehead, explaining that his investors were demanding a massive pitch that weekend. He could not leave the state. I believed him. I hugged him tightly at the airport departures gate, burying my face in his chest, feeling grateful for his quiet strength. He promised to hold down the fort and call me every single night. I boarded that plane, unaware I was handing him the keys to my destruction. I spent the next 4 weeks sitting in a sterilized hospital room, watching machines breathe for the only parent I had left. I barely slept. I rarely ate. Torin's calls grew shorter. Then they stopped altogether. My mother passed away on a quiet Thursday evening, slipping away while rain hammered against the hospital windows. I was entirely alone. I pulled out my phone with trembling hands and dialed Torin. It went straight to voicemail. I tried again. Nothing. I called Vespera, hoping she might know where he was. Her number was disconnected. A cold dread began to coil in my stomach, separate from the grief. For 3 days, I organized my mother's cremation in a robotic haze, constantly checking my phone. Torin had not sent a single message. I convinced myself he had been in a terrible accident. Panic replaced my sorrow. I booked an emergency flight back home, abandoning the rest of my mother's estate paperwork. The flight felt like a suffocating eternity. I imagined walking into a hospital to find Torin injured. I never imagined the reality waiting for me. I took a cab straight from the airport to our house in the hills. The driveway was full. Torin's car was parked next to Vespera's sleek silver sedan. A third car, a white SUV I did not recognize, sat near the garage. Relief washed over me briefly. He was home. He was safe. I dragged my heavy suitcase up the front steps, digging through my purse for my keys. I slid my key into the heavy oak door, but it refused to turn. Someone had entirely replaced the deadbolt.
I rattled the doorknob, confused and exhausted. I knocked loudly, but the heavy oak muffled the sound. Dropping my bags on the porch, I walked around to the large bay windows facing the living room. The sheer curtains were partially open, so I could see inside perfectly. The breath violently left my lungs. Torin had pushed aside the modern furniture I had saved up for. Toys scattered across the expensive hardwood floor. Vespera sat on my velvet sofa, laughing warmly while holding a toddler on her lap. Torin stood by the fireplace, his arm wrapped tightly around the waist of a stunning woman with dark hair. Her name, I would later learn, was Zariel. A little boy looking exactly like Torin tugged at his pant leg. They looked like a picture-perfect family. My mind violently rejected what my eyes were seeing. I stepped back, stumbling into the rose bushes I planted the previous spring. Thorns tore into my jeans, grounding me in the sharp physical pain. Torin had a second family. Vespera knew. She sat right there, reveling in it. I grabbed a decorative rock from the landscaping and marched back to the front door, slamming it against the wood until the glass panes rattled. The laughter inside stopped abruptly. Footsteps approached. The door swung open, revealing Vespera. She looked down at me, her lips curling into a wicked, triumphant smirk.
Vespera did not look surprised to see me shivering on the porch. She looked utterly victorious. She stepped outside, pulling the door partially shut behind her to block my view of Torin and the others. I demanded to know what was going on, my voice cracking from exhaustion and shock. Instead of answering, she reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a thick manila envelope. She shoved it into my chest. I opened it with numb fingers. They were divorce papers. Torin filed them weeks ago under false pretenses of abandonment. He hired a corrupt process server to sign off that I received them while I was sitting next to my dying mother. She used a fraudulent transfer deed buried in the paperwork to put the house entirely in Torin's name. I looked up at her, my vision blurring with hot tears. She leaned in close, smelling of expensive perfume and malice. She whispered that Torin finally had the real family he deserved, and I was just an ugly stepping stone, a temporary bankroll. She told me to leave before she called the police to report a trespasser. Any other day, I would have screamed, I would have fought. But standing there, broken and exhausted, a terrifying calmness washed over my mind. I nodded slowly, picked up my suitcase, and walked away without a single word. I walked 2 miles down the winding canyon road, dragging that heavy suitcase. The wheels rattled aggressively over the asphalt, but I barely heard them. I hailed a cab at the main intersection and directed the driver to a cheap motel off the highway. The room smelled heavily of stale smoke and bleach, but I did not care. I sat on the edge of the sagging mattress and finally let the tears fall. I wept for my mother. I wept for the years I wasted building a life with a ghost. After an hour of pathetic sobbing, I wiped my face and opened the manila envelope again. Vespera meticulously forged the entire stack of documents. She clearly orchestrated the entire legal maneuver. Torin lacked the intelligence for something this precise. He was just the cowardly beneficiary. I read every single line. They drained our joint savings account the day after my flight to London. They transferred my shares of our tech startup into a blind trust controlled by Vespera. I was left with exactly $12 in my checking account and massive credit card debt Torin generated funding Zariel's lifestyle. It was a complete, calculated financial execution. The sheer audacity of their greed extinguished my sadness. A freezing, venomous anger took root in my chest. They assumed I would crawl away into poverty and disappear. They severely underestimated exactly how hard I was willing to fight back. I spent the next 3 days practically locked in that motel room, living on vending machine crackers and tap water. I needed a strategy. A frontal legal assault was useless. Vespera had deep pockets and corrupt judges on her payroll. I had to destroy them from the inside out. I had to become someone they would never suspect. I started with my appearance. I walked to a discount pharmacy and bought a box of jet black hair dye, stripping away the soft brown curls Torin used to love. I cut my hair into a harsh, sharp bob in the motel bathroom mirror. I sold my engagement ring at a pawn shop down the street. It hurt to part with it, but the diamonds paid for a decent laptop and a burner phone. I began mapping out Vespera's entire social and financial ecosystem. She ran an elite philanthropic board that heavily dictated the city's real estate zoning laws. Vespera used the charity to launder money and fast-track permits for Torin's failing tech developments. She had a massive gala coming up in 2 months. I happened to know her previous coordinator, a woman named Oressa, who hated Vespera with a burning passion. I picked up my burner phone and made my first move. I met Aressa at a dark corner booth in a rundown diner across town. She took one look at my chopped hair and hollow eyes and ordered me a black coffee. I laid out the entire situation. I told her about the changed locks and the forged deeds. Aressa listened quietly, her jaw tightening. She quit Vespera's charity board after catching the matriarch skimming donation funds to pay for private country club memberships. Aressa despised her. I asked for a way into Vespera's financial network. Aressa slid a napkin across the table with a name scribbled on it. Cassian. He was Vespera's private wealth manager, a sleazy opportunist who handled all the shadow accounts. Aressa explained that Cassian was currently looking for a junior data analyst who could work entirely remotely, someone desperate enough to ignore the shady numbers. I applied for the job that very night under my mother's maiden name. I doctored a flawless resume using my architectural background to fake extensive structural data management skills. I knew how to build things, which meant I knew exactly how to spot structural weaknesses. Cassian interviewed me over a brief phone call. He sounded arrogant and entirely bored. He hired me on the spot for minimum wage. I had successfully breached the perimeter. Now I just needed to start digging through the dirt.
The digital files Cassian handed over contained a gold mine of absolute corruption. I spent 18 hours a day huddled over my cheap laptop in that dingy motel room, tracing wire transfers and offshore holding companies. Vespera was much worse than I ever imagined. She was not just shielding Torin's failures, she was actively bleeding her own investors dry. I found the hidden ledgers documenting massive payouts to a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands. A quick cross-reference revealed that Torin was the primary beneficiary. He used the stolen charity money to prop up his dying tech startup. I dug into the personal expenses Vespera authorized for Zariel. The secret second wife was bleeding Vespera completely dry. I found receipts for exorbitant luxury cars and ridiculously expensive jewelry, all billed directly to Vespera's personal accounts. Vespera hated spending her own money. She only tolerated Zariel because she provided the male heir Torin always wanted. Zariel clearly knew this and extorted Vespera for every single cent she could grab. The tension between them had to be massive. It was a house of cards held together by mutual greed and secrets. If I pulled the right string, they would absolutely tear each other to pieces. I smiled at my glowing screen in the dark room. I finally had my weapons. Before I could strike, I needed them completely relaxed. I had to convince Vespera that I was entirely broken and out of the picture permanently. I drafted a pathetic, desperate email to Torin from my actual account. I begged him for a few $1,000s just to get an apartment. I told him I was sleeping in my car and looking for waitressing jobs. It made me physically sick to type those groveling words, but it worked perfectly. Torin never replied, but 24 hours later, Cassian casually mentioned during our morning briefing that Vespera was in an incredibly good mood. She bragged to him that the trash had finally taken itself out. They stopped looking over their shoulders. They thought I was beaten. With their guard down, I initiated the second phase of my plan. I created a fake, untraceable email address and sent a highly classified financial document straight to Zariel's personal inbox. It was a drafted, unsigned prenuptial agreement Vespera commissioned for Torin and Zariel behind their backs. The document stated that in the event of a divorce, Zariel would get absolutely nothing, and Vespera would immediately take full custody of the children. It was a nuclear bomb wrapped in legal jargon. I hit send, sat back, and waited for the explosion. The fallout happened faster than I anticipated. I hacked into the security cameras at Vespera's estate using an old admin password Torin carelessly left in his browser history months ago. The grainy black and white feed showed Zariel storming into the grand foyer, violently waving a printed stack of papers. Vespera stood near the staircase, looking genuinely stunned. I turned up the audio feed. Zariel screamed about the custody clause, her voice cracking with authentic hysteria. Vespera immediately went on the defensive, denying she ever finalized the document, but Zariel refused to listen. She threatened to pack up her kids and move to a non-extradition country if Vespera ever tried to legally trap her. Vespera's face twisted into absolute fury.
She demanded respect, reminding Zariel exactly who funded her lavish lifestyle. The argument escalated into a vicious screaming match. Torin eventually stumbled downstairs, looking utterly pathetic as he tried to pacify two women who were actively plotting against each other. He looked weak. Zariel shoved him away, demanding he chose a side right then and there. Torin just stammered, caught in the crossfire of his own cowardice. Watching them tear each other apart from a cheap motel room brought a dark, twisted satisfaction to my chest. The cracks were forming. Now I just needed to whiten them. Zariel punishing Torin gave me the perfect opening to squeeze him financially. His tech startup bled capital daily. Vespera usually covered the deficit, but she suddenly cut off his funding to punish Zariel's outburst. Torin panicked. I watched the desperate emails he sent Cassian begging for emergency bridge loans. Using my fake junior analyst credentials, I intercepted the request. I drafted a highly realistic denial letter stating the board flagged his company for severe financial inconsistencies. I routed it through Cassian's outbox while he played golf out of state. Torin hit a brick wall. Without Vespera's money, his payroll bounced within a week. His lead developers immediately quit. I wanted to see the desperation on his face, so I parked down the street from his office building in a rented sedan. I watched him pace the sidewalk, aggressively screaming into his cell phone and pulling at his hair. He looked completely unhinged. The confident, slick man who abandoned me vanished. He drowned in debt he could no longer hide. I felt a sharp pang of grief, not for him, but for the illusion I once loved. I quickly crushed the feeling. Grief makes you weak. Rage keeps you sharp. I drove back to my motel, ready to sever his final lifeline.
Torin had no options left. He did exactly what a cornered rat does. He tried to steal from his own house. I monitored the financial logs as he attempted to liquidate Zariel's personal jewelry collection and transfer the funds to his business account. Zariel caught him red-handed. The security cameras captured her physically attacking him in the master bedroom, hurling expensive vases and screaming about his pathetic failures. She packed 3 massive suitcases that same night. She grabbed the kids and fled to a luxury hotel downtown, charging the exorbitant suite directly to Vespera's black card. Vespera lost her mind. She cancelled the card immediately, leaving Zariel stranded at the front desk with a declined payment and crying children. Zariel retaliated with absolute venom. She called a high-profile divorce attorney from the hotel lobby. She filed for emergency sole custody and requested massive spousal support, citing Torin's financial instability and erratic behavior. She essentially used the exact same legal playbook Vespera used against me. Watching Vespera's own weapon turn around and strike her family felt intensely poetic. Torin was effectively homeless, locked out of his own house by Vespera, and legally barred from seeing his kids by Zariel. The syndicate imploded spectacularly. But Vespera still held the actual wealth, and I wanted it all.
Taking down Vespera required isolating her completely. Cassian represented her only remaining shield. He managed the offshore accounts, shielding her illegal charity skims. I spent a week compiling every single fraudulent wire transfer he authorized over the past 5 years. I packaged the evidence neatly into a digital dossier and sent it directly to Cassian's personal phone. I added a simple text message warning him to resign today and leave the country, or I would forward the files to federal authorities. Cassian was a coward who valued his own skin above everything else. He did not even bother packing his office. He booked a one-way ticket to Geneva that afternoon and sent a frantic resignation email to Vespera citing a sudden family emergency. He transferred the master administrative access for all the shadow accounts to my burner email, assuming I was a blackmailer who just wanted control of the funds. He gave me the keys to the kingdom. I logged into the offshore portal and stared at the 9-figure balance staring back at me. This money represented years of exploitation, lies, and ruined lives. I immediately initiated a mass transfer. I did not take a single dime for myself. I wired the entire balance to the original charitable foundations Vespera stole it from, leaving her shadow accounts at 0. Vespera discovered the empty accounts exactly 12 hours later. I hacked her office webcam to witness the exact moment her empire evaporated. She stared at the computer monitor, her arrogant face draining of all color.
She violently slammed her fists against her mahogany desk, knocking over a heavy crystal lamp that shattered across the hardwood floor. She grabbed her phone with trembling hands and dialed Cassian repeatedly, receiving nothing but a cold, disconnected tone. She realized she was entirely bankrupt. The brilliant part was her absolute silence. She could not report the massive theft to the police. If she did, she would immediately confess to embezzling the charity funds in the first place. She sat alone in her dark office, completely trapped in a legal and financial prison of her own making. Her grand philanthropic gala loomed just 3 days away. She planned to announce a massive new real estate acquisition at the event, relying entirely on those stolen funds to back her public promises. Now she held absolutely nothing. She faced total public humiliation, the only consequence she feared more than death itself. I bought a stunning blood-red evening gown with the last few bills from my pawned ring. I fully intended to attend that gala. I wanted a front-row seat to watch the matriarch burn to ash. I spent hours getting ready for the gala in the cramped motel bathroom. I applied sharp, dark makeup that made my hollow cheekbones look predatory. Slipping into the blood-red gown felt like putting on armor. The reflection staring back at me looked nothing like the naive woman who cried over a dying marriage just weeks ago. I looked dangerous. I called a black car service, spending my absolute last dollar to arrive in style. The charity gala took place at the Grand City Museum, a massive building filled with marble statues and judging eyes. I walked up the grand stone steps, holding my breath. I bypassed the main guest list by flashing a fake catering manager badge I printed at a local library. No one stopped me. I slipped into the crowded ballroom, blending into the sea of silk dresses and tailored tuxedos. The room buzzed with wealthy donors holding crystal champagne flutes. I grabbed a glass from a passing tray and scanned the crowd. Vespera stood near the main stage. She wore a suffocatingly tight silver dress, but her usual arrogant posture sagged. She gripped a cocktail napkin so tightly her knuckles turned white. She was absolutely terrified.
A loud microphone feedback screech silenced the ballroom. The board president, a heavyset man who unknowingly funded Vespera's offshore accounts, called her up to the podium. He eagerly announced that Vespera was ready to unveil the massive land acquisition that would secure the charity's future for decades. A polite smattering of applause echoed through the room. Vespera slowly climbed the short stairs. She looked physically ill. The stage lights highlighted the sudden, deep wrinkles around her mouth. She clutched the podium microphone, her hands visibly shaking. She started thanking the donors, her voice cracking slightly. She tried to stall, launching into a long, rambling story about her late husband. People started murmuring. They expected numbers and blueprints, not pathetic nostalgia. I moved closer to the front, stepping out from behind a massive ice sculpture. Vespera locked eyes with me. She stopped speaking entirely. A dead, horrifying silence fell over the ballroom. She recognized the sharp jawline and the intense stare, even with the black hair and red dress. She saw the ghost of the woman she destroyed, standing right in front of her, smiling coldly. Vespera gripped the podium so hard the microphone stand wobbled. She opened her mouth to speak, but only a dry gasp came out. Right at that exact second, I pressed a single button on my burner phone hidden inside my clutch. I triggered a mass email blast to every single board member and high-level donor in the room. I harvested their contact information from Cassian's files days ago. A wave of synchronized notification chimes erupted across the ballroom. People looked down at their phones. Brows furrowed, gasps echoed over the quiet classical music. The email contained undeniable, hard evidence of Vespera's embezzlement. It showed the wire transfers moving directly from the charity fund into her personal shell companies. It showed the exact amounts she spent on Zariel's luxury cars and Torin's failing business. The board president read the email from the front row. His face turned violently red. He looked up at Vespera, pointing a thick, accusatory finger right at her chest. He yelled across the silent room, demanding to know where the money went. Vespera backed away from the podium, shaking her head frantically.
She looked like a trapped animal. The entire elite society she worshipped turned against her in less than 60 seconds.
Vespera abandoned the stage. She scrambled down the back stairs, pushing past a waiter and nearly falling over her expensive heels. She ran down a long, dimly lit marble hallway leading toward the loading docks. I followed her quietly. I found her pacing in a dark storage room among stacks of folded chairs, desperately trying to dial someone on her cell phone. She turned around and screamed when she saw me standing in the doorway. She threw her phone at my head. It shattered against the wall behind me. She lunged forward, her silver dress tearing at the seam, and grabbed my shoulders. She shook me violently, screaming that I ruined her life. I did not flinch. I just grabbed her wrists and slowly pushed her hands away with a terrifying calm. I told her she ruined her own life the second she forged my signature while my mother took her final breaths. Vespera stumbled backward, hitting a stack of chairs. She sobbed pathetically, begging me to give the money back. She offered to force Torin to remarry me. The offer made me laugh out loud. The harsh sound bounced off the cold concrete walls. I realized right then that she truly thought money and status could fix everything. I leaned in close to Vespera's ear and whispered that the offshore accounts were completely empty. I told her I gave every single stolen dime back to the charities she robbed. She let out a guttural, horrified wail and slumped entirely onto the concrete floor. The sound of distant police sirens echoed through the loading dock doors. The board president wasted no time making the call. I turned my back on the sobbing matriarch and walked out into the cool night air. I felt an incredible weight lift off my chest. Vespera was finished. She faced inevitable federal prison time for grand larceny and fraud. But my job was not done yet. Vespera built the corrupt foundation, but Torin and Zariel happily lived inside the house. I walked blocks away from the museum and tossed my fake catering badge into a storm drain. Torin currently slept on a dirty mattress in his empty office building, hiding from his creditors. Zariel sat in a hotel room she could no longer afford, waiting for a custody battle she could never win. They destroyed my family. Now I fully intended to make sure they tore whatever remained of theirs to absolute shreds. I found Torin exactly where I expected. His tech office looked like a tomb. The power company cut the electricity 2 days ago. He sat on the floor near a large corner window, illuminated only by the orange glow of the streetlights outside. He wore the same wrinkled dress shirt he had on during the fight with Zariel. Empty takeout containers surrounded him. I pushed open the unlocked glass door and walked in. The sharp click of my heels echoing in the empty room made him jump violently. He squinted at my silhouette, struggling to recognize me with the black hair and red gown. When he finally realized it was me, he practically scrambled backward against the glass. He looked terrified. I pulled up a single rolling chair and sat down right in front of him. I told him Vespera was currently sitting in a police interrogation room, facing federal fraud charges. His eyes widened in pure panic. He stammered, asking what happened to his mother's money. I smiled coldly. I explained that every single offshore account was frozen and returned to the charities. Torin grabbed his hair, hyperventilating. He realized nobody was coming to save him. The safety net he relied on his entire pathetic life simply vanished. I leaned forward and whispered the final lie he needed to hear. I told him Zariel made a secret immunity deal with the authorities to testify against him. I signed the immense stack of legal paperwork at the clerk's desk, my hand moving mechanically across the dotted lines. The physical reality of owning that massive space felt completely surreal. When Mateo and I finally exited the stuffy courtroom into the marble hallway, Silvestra stood blocking our path. Her lawyer had wisely abandoned her. She looked incredibly small, a hollow shell of the terrifying tyrant who ruined my life just months ago. "You think this makes you a chef?" she hissed, her voice shaking violently with rage. "You think stealing my walls gives you my talent? You will fail in that building, Kalia. The industry will never respect a traitor." I stopped walking and looked down at her.
A profound sense of pity finally replaced the bitter hatred burning inside my chest. She literally had nothing left but her delusions. "I did not steal your walls," I replied softly, feeling the tension finally drain from my shoulders. "I bought them at a heavy discount because you destroyed their value. I am going to rip out your kitchen, throw away your fake ingredients, and build something real over your ashes." She raised her hand, entirely ready to strike me right across the face in front of the county guards. I did not even flinch. I just waited. She slowly lowered her arm, realizing she possessed absolutely no power anymore.
Torin drove like an absolute maniac across town. I kept a safe distance, watching his taillights swerve recklessly through late-night traffic. He pulled up to the luxury hotel where Zariel was hiding and left his car idling directly on the curb. He stormed past the valet, looking completely deranged. I parked quietly across the street and walked into the grand lobby just in time to see him bypass the security desk. He forced his way onto an elevator behind a group of wealthy tourists. I knew exactly which rooms Zariel booked because I monitored the declined credit card charges days earlier. I took the service elevator up to the 12th floor. The long hallway smelled of expensive linen and heavy floral air fresheners. I heard the frantic screaming before I even reached the correct corridor. Torin was violently pounding his bare fists against the heavy mahogany door of Suite 1204. He screamed Zariel's name, calling her a traitor and a parasite. Other doors down the hall began to open. Annoyed guests peeked out to see the commotion. Zariel eventually ripped her door open, looking exhausted and furious. She wore a silk bathrobe and held a crying toddler on her hip. Torin shoved his way inside the room before she could stop him, slamming the heavy door shut behind them. I walked quietly down the hall and pressed my ear against the cold wood of the suite door. Torin aggressively accused Zariel of selling him out to the federal authorities. Zariel screamed back, completely confused, but matching his unhinged rage. She called him a pathetic loser who could not even afford to pay for his own children's hotel room. The argument turned incredibly ugly in a matter of seconds. Torin started throwing heavy objects across the room. I heard glass shattering against a wall and the two children wailing in sheer terror. Zariel shrieked at the top of her lungs, threatening to call the police immediately. Torin laughed like a cornered maniac, yelling that the police were already coming for him because of her secret immunity deal. Their mutual toxicity fed off each other perfectly. They were two parasites violently fighting over a dead host. A heavy-set hotel security guard suddenly stepped off the elevator at the end of the hall, walking briskly toward the noise. I quickly ducked into an alcove near the ice machine to hide myself. The guard banged aggressively on the door, demanding they open up. Zariel flung the door open, crying hysterically. She pointed a shaking finger at Torin and demanded the guard restrain him for assault. Torin tried to physically run past the guard, but he tripped over a metal room service cart left in the hallway.
Torin crashed hard onto the carpeted floor, knocking over a metal tray full of dirty plates. The security guard immediately pinned his arms behind his back and radioed the front desk for the local police. Torin thrashed around wildly on the ground, screaming absolute nonsense about offshore accounts and secret immunity deals. He looked like a complete lunatic. Zariel stood frozen in the doorway, holding her crying toddler, watching the wealthy father of her children get treated like a dangerous criminal. Two actual police officers arrived within 10 minutes. They pulled Torin to his feet, handcuffed him tightly, and dragged him towards the service elevator. As they walked past my dark hiding spot near the ice machine, Torin suddenly locked eyes with me. He stopped struggling. He finally realized the ugly truth. He saw the cold, mocking smile on my face and realized there never was a secret immunity deal. I manufactured the entire conflict just to watch him self-destruct. He started screaming my name, warning the officers the guy set the whole thing up. The police ignored him, shoving him into the elevator to shut him up. Zariel was left standing alone in the quiet hallway. The hotel manager approached her moments later, firmly informing her she needed to vacate the unpaid suite immediately. She had no money, no husband, and no matriarch left to fund her life. She was entirely ruined. I stepped out of the shadows and walked casually to the stairwell.
I left the hotel through a side exit, stepping out into the chilly night air.
The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers faded into the distance. Torin was gone. Zariel was packing her bags to nowhere. Vespera was sitting in a federal holding cell. I walked back to my rental car and finally took a deep, unfiltered breath. I felt a strange emptiness alongside the victory. Revenge does not bring the dead back. It did not bring my mother back to me. I drove back to my dingy motel room, took off the blood-red dress, and washed the heavy makeup off my face. The next morning, the local news practically exploded. Vespera's face dominated the morning broadcast. The wealthy philanthropist was officially charged with multiple counts of wire fraud and embezzlement. The charity board immediately launched a massive public relations campaign to distance themselves from her entirely. She was universally despised overnight. I sat on my sagging motel bed, eating a stale granola bar, and watched her perp walk on a tiny television screen. She looked incredibly small, hiding her face behind a manila folder as officers escorted her into a transport van. Torin made the news cycle right after her. He was held on domestic disturbance and assault charges without bail.
Torin sat in county jail, expecting his mother to post his bail. Totally unaware, she was locked up in a federal facility across the state. They were completely cut off from one another. Vespera hired a ruthless public defender, having zero access to her usual high-priced legal team. She immediately tried to negotiate a plea deal. She threw Torin directly under the bus. She claimed her son manipulated her into stealing the charity funds to save his failing tech company. She painted herself as a vulnerable widow taken advantage of by a greedy child. I laughed out loud when I read the leaked court transcripts online. She genuinely believed sacrificing her golden boy would save her own skin. Torin reacted exactly as I predicted when his court-appointed lawyer relayed her statement. He snapped. He demanded to speak to the federal prosecutors. He spent 4 hours detailing every single illegal real estate bribe Vespera ever orchestrated. He handed them the names of every corrupt zoning official on her payroll. He basically handed the federal government a fully loaded shotgun and pointed it directly at his mother's head. They were tearing each other apart from separate cages, doing all the heavy lifting for me. I did not even have to lift a finger anymore. Their innate selfishness simply took over. They possessed absolutely zero loyalty to anyone but themselves, and it destroyed them faster than I ever could.
While they waged war from their prison cells, I quietly hired a fiercely competent real estate attorney, using the last bit of credit I had to my name. I handed her the solid proof of Vespera's forgery regarding my divorce papers and the deed to our house. The corrupt process server Vespera hired panicked the second my lawyer threatened to involve the district attorney. He flipped immediately, signing a sworn affidavit confessing to the entire fraudulent scheme. The judge overturned the fake divorce decree in a matter of days. I was legally married to Torin again, which gave me immediate access to the marital assets he tried to steal. I legally seized the house in the hills. Torin abandoned it weeks ago when the power got shut off, leaving it a complete mess. I drove up the winding canyon road and parked in the empty driveway. I slid my original key into the deadbolt. It turned perfectly. I pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped inside. The silence felt different this time. It felt like ownership. The fake family was gone, leaving behind scattered toys and unpaid bills. I walked through the living room, stepping over the garbage they left behind. I stood by the large bay windows where I first saw them laughing together. I felt absolutely nothing for the memories attached to these walls. I just wanted my equity back. I spent the next 2 weeks cleaning the house from top to bottom. I hired a junk removal company to haul away every single piece of furniture Torin and Zariel touched. I wanted no trace of them left in my space. Once the house was completely empty and staged, I put it on the market. It sold above asking price in less than 5 days. The massive wire transfer hit my newly secured bank account, giving me back the financial stability they aggressively tried to strip away. During the escrow period, I checked up on Zariel. She had moved into a tiny, cramped apartment in a terrible neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. She was working night shifts at a diner to feed Torin's children. She had no nanny, no luxury SUV, and no massive bankroll to fund her arrogance. Torin legally could not pay child support from a jail cell. She was forced to live the exact working-class life Vespera always mocked me for. I considered sending her a mocking letter, but I realized she simply was not worth the postage. She was already living her own personal nightmare. She had to wake up every single day and face the harsh reality of her choices.
I filed the actual legal divorce papers against Torin exactly 1 month after his arrest. I cited absolute infidelity and financial abuse. I attached copies of his criminal charges just to make the filing brutally heavy. He received the paperwork in county jail. My lawyer told me he actually cried during the legal consultation. He begged her to pass along a message asking me to forgive him. He claimed he still loved me and that Vespera forced him to do everything. He was still shifting the blame, entirely incapable of taking any real responsibility for his own actions. I told my lawyer to throw the message in the trash. The judge granted the divorce rapidly. I legally stripped Torin of everything. I took the remaining liquid cash from our joint accounts to cover my legal fees and left him with the massive debt he racked up funding Zariel. He was completely bankrupt, facing years in prison and legally tethered to a mother who actively tried to ruin him to save herself. I walked out of the courthouse on a bright, sunny Tuesday morning, holding my final divorce decree. I felt entirely free. The suffocating weight I carried since the day my mother died finally lifted off my shoulders.
Vespera's federal trial began 6 months later. I attended the sentencing hearing simply to close the chapter. I sat in the very back row of the cold, wood-paneled courtroom, surrounded by angry charity donors who came to watch her fall. Vespera sat at the defense table looking entirely unrecognizable. She wore a standard, oversized gray prison jumpsuit instead of her tailored designer dresses. Her perfectly styled hair had grown out, revealing harsh, neglected white roots. She looked frail, old, and entirely defeated. The prosecutors systematically dismantled her entire life, displaying the stolen wire transfers on a massive projector screen. Torin actually took the witness stand against her. He wore his own Orange County Jail uniform, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He looked at his mother with absolute disgust and detailed exactly how she forced him to launder the stolen money. Vespera stared back at him with tears streaming down her heavily wrinkled face. She finally realized her relentless need for absolute control completely destroyed the only son she claimed to love. The judge showed absolute zero leniency. He sentenced Vespera to 15 years in federal prison without the possibility of early parole. She collapsed heavily into her chair, sobbing loudly as the bailiff handcuffed her wrists. I stood up and quietly walked out of the courtroom before she ever turned around to look at me. I did not need her acknowledgement anymore.
Torin received his own sentence a few weeks later. His eager cooperation with the federal prosecutors earned him a slightly reduced term, but the judge still handed him 4 solid years in a state facility for the fraud and domestic assault charges. He lost his tech company completely. His angry creditors seized the remaining servers and office equipment, selling everything at a public auction for absolute pennies. He went from a cocky startup founder to a convicted felon with absolutely zero assets to his name. I stopped tracking their miserable lives entirely after that day. Monitoring their pain kept me tethered to their toxicity, and I wanted total, permanent severing. I took the massive profit from selling the house in the hills and opened my own independent architectural firm. I rented a bright, airy loft space downtown, filling it with massive drafting tables and natural sunlight. I hired young, hungry designers who actually valued hard work over blatant nepotism. I poured every ounce of my residual anger and grief directly into my blueprints. I started designing sustainable housing projects, focusing on building solid foundations for people who truly needed a safe place to land. My firm became incredibly successful within just 1 year. I built my new life entirely on my own terms. The ghost of my broken marriage finally stopped haunting my quiet moments.
With my architectural firm thriving and my financial security completely restored, I finally found the quiet time to properly grieve. I booked a direct flight back to London, safely carrying my mother's ashes in a simple, heavy wooden urn. I rented a small car and drove out to the quiet coastal village where she grew up. The cold wind whipped fiercely off the gray ocean, biting sharply at my cheeks as I walked down to the empty, rocky beach. I stood near the water's edge and gently let the ashes scatter into the crashing waves. I spoke out loud, apologizing to her for wasting so many years trying to impress a corrupt family that viewed me as disposable trash. I promised her I would never shrink my own ambition to fit into someone else's narrow expectations ever again. Standing on that freezing beach, I felt an intense, overwhelming sense of clarity. Vespera actively tried to bury me alive. She arrogantly assumed my intense grief over losing my only parent would make me an easy, pathetic target. She severely underestimated the sheer destructive force of a woman who has absolutely nothing left to lose. I did not just survive her vicious, calculated betrayal. I weaponized my own heartbreak and burned her entire fraudulent empire to the ground. I walked back up the sandy hill toward my rental car, leaving the ugly past completely behind me in the salt water.
Today, Vespera sits in a federal concrete cell, permanently stripped of her designer clothes and her arrogant social status. She spends her miserable days arguing with strict prison guards instead of bossing around wealthy charity boards. Torin currently works in the state prison laundry room, earning absolute pennies an hour to slowly pay off massive court-mandated restitution fees. Zariel recently filed for complete bankruptcy and moved back in with her estranged parents across the country, entirely unable to sustain the crushing debt she accumulated trying to fake a luxurious lifestyle. They violently turned on each other the exact second the money disappeared. They proved that a fake family built strictly on lies, manipulation, and stolen wealth will always collapse under its own ugly weight. I proudly kept my maiden name. I never remarried, choosing to protect my peace above everything else. I bought a stunning glass house overlooking the entire city, meticulously designing the interior layout myself. I fill my weekends with quiet mornings, strong black coffee, and absolute freedom. I sleep incredibly well, knowing I orchestrated the exact justice the broken legal system would have ignored entirely. I aggressively took back my dignity, my assets, and my stolen future. I forced them to swallow the exact same poison they eagerly poured for me. I am Kalia, the architect they tried to completely demolish. Instead of breaking, I simply redesigned the entire game and watched them willingly tear themselves apart.
Wow, taking a breath after telling that whole story always feels a bit heavy. Thank you so much for sticking with me until the very end. The biggest moral lesson I learned from this entire nightmare is that true wealth is not about offshore accounts or expensive houses. True wealth is your integrity, your resilience, and your ability to rebuild your life even when the people you trusted most tried to burn it down. Never let toxic people convince you that your kindness is a weakness. When they push you into a corner, you have every right to show them exactly how hard you can fight back. Now, I want to hear your honest thoughts on how I handled everything. Do you think my revenge was completely justified given what they did to me while my mother was dying? Or did I go a little too far by financially destroying Vespera and pitting them all against each other? Let me know down in the comments. I read every single one of them. If you enjoyed hearing my story and want more intense real-life drama and revenge content, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Your support means the absolute world to me and helps me keep sharing these crazy experiences. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you guys in the next video.